Hey everyone, it's Mostly Casual Commander. I'm BK. You can join us on Instagram and Discord. Links are in the description. Busterkins won the die roll with Eriette of the Charmed Apple. This is a Voltron commander using auras to buff up his creatures. Kyle's playing Yuriko, the Tiger Shadow. His army of ninjas paired with top deck manipulation are going to drain out his opponents. I'm up next with Meren of Clan Neltoth. It's Golgari, Aristocrat, Reanimator, and those are some of my favorite words in Magic. And lastly, we have Scott playing Lathiel, the Bounteous Dawn. He's going to gain all sorts of life, which means +1/+1 counters as well. And he's going to smash into his opponents. Please subscribe to support us, and especially if you love cats, stick around for an appearance from my fat cat Meatball. He's so chunky. Busterkin started by playing a Plains and passing to Kyle, who played an island, into a Triton Shore Stalker. This thing can't be blocked. Then he casts Ornithopter as well. He passes the turn, Scott kicks the camera. I play Woodland Cemetery as my land for turn before passing to Scott, who plays a Forest. And then he casts a turn 1 Soul Ring. What? Then he says go over to Busterkins on turn 2. He draws, misses a land drop that he desperately needed, has to discard, passes to Kyle, who plays a Swamp. Then he moves into combat, swinging Ornithopter at Scott and Shore Stalker at me. He ninjutsus out Yuriko in place of the Ornithopter, dealing 1 point of damage to each one of us, triggering his commander, revealing a Swamp which does nothing. Then he recasts Ornithopter for 0. According to Kyle, it's the best ninja in the deck. Then he passes the turn over to me. I draw a card because I'm supposed to. Then I play High Market as my land for turn, which could allow me to sack things later. Speaking of sack, I play Sakura Tribe Elder, aka Steve, who finds me a land if I kill him. On Scott's turn 2, he plays a Plains as his land and then casts his commander, Lathiel, the Bounteous Dawn, thanks to his fancy signed Soul Ring. He passes the turn over to Busterkins, and he plays a Swamp. He found it, yay, to cast Orzhov's Signet. Then he passes the turn over to Kyle, who goes right into the red zone, attacking Busterkins and Scott. When he does so, he triggers his commander, revealing the top card from his library, which is an arcane adaptation, draining each one of his opponents for 3. Then he plays a Swamp as his land for turn, before casting Fairy Seer. When that ETBs, it scries 2. At the end of the turn, I sack my Steve and go find a Swamp that comes into the battlefield tapped. Kyle bottoms the 2 Scry Boys that he had, and then it's on to my turn. I draw my card, and then I play Golgari Signet. And I follow that up by playing an Apprentice Necromancer. This thing can kill itself to find me a thing from my graveyard and put it back onto the battlefield. Gaining haste, too. On Scott's turn, he plays a Forest as his land before casting Court of Garenbrig. When that ETBs, he becomes the Monarch, so he'll start drawing cards at the end of his turn. In addition, and on his upkeep, he gets to throw around some +1 counters, which is great for him. He moves into combat, swinging at Busterkins, dealing him 2 points of commander damage. Scott will gain 2, and then Lathiel says, yo, gain 2 counters. When Scott goes to draw off the Monarch, Kyle flashes an Orcish Bowmaster, pinging Scott in the face. He also amasses Orcs. Also a slight error, it looks like they thought the ability happened twice for some reason. It did not, just once, but it doesn't matter at all. On Busterkin's turn, he plays a Mind Stone, and thanks to that, he can cast Transcendent Envoy, reducing the cost of his auras by 1 generic manas. He passes the turn over to Kyle. He draws, and then he plays that arcane adaptation that we saw earlier, so now all of his creatures are ninjas. Can you believe it? He then moves into the red zone and attacks in such ways that it guarantees that he'll get the damage through. Once he does, it'll trigger Yuriko because all of them are now ninjas. So each one of them procs Yuriko, so he gets to reveal 3 whole cards. This will result in us being drained out for 10 points of life. Then he puts all 3 of those cards into his hand. Must be nice. He got the Monarch off of Scott. We just forgot to move the card, so he drew. Then he passed the turn over to me. I play my commander, Meren of Clan Neltoth. With her out onto the battlefield, I want to get my murder train running, so I sacrifice my Apprentice Necromancer. Meren's like, wow, I'm so experienced. Then I get to return Steve to the battlefield, who has haste. So I move into combat with it, dealing 1 point of damage to Scott. Then he's like, oh yeah, Kyle should probably have this, giving him the Monarch token. I deal 1 point of damage to Scott. Then I sacrifice Steve because of his own ability, not the Apprentice Necromancer. Meren gains more experience, and then I get to go find a land. At the end step, Meren says, bring back a 2-drop, so I get my Sakura Tribe Elder once again. On to Scott's turn. On his upkeep, he gets more +1 counters thanks to his enchantment. Then he plays a Temple Garden, taking 2. As a follow-up, he plays Good Fortune Unicorn. He's aiming to get even more +1 counters on his stuff. He's so greedy. He moves into combat, swinging again at Busterkins, who just takes his beats. Scott will then gain 6 points of life, and then his commander will gain 6 +1/+1 counters on it. On Busterkins' turn, he plays a Tainted Field. Then he does a little jig, because he's happy he got a land. He moves into combat at Scott. He felt like some payback was in order, so he pings him down and then casts Winds of Wrath, being terrified by the board state. In response, I sacrifice my Sakura Tribe Elder, getting another land. Then Winds of Wrath resolves, wiping the board. He passes the turn over to Kyle, who plays an island. He then casts Siren Storm Tamer. That guy says he's a Siren Pirate Wizard Ninja. As a follow-up, he casts Dimir Infiltrator. That guy's an unblockable Spirit Ninja. Can you believe it? He moves to end step. Monarch triggers. He draws a card. On my turn, I recast my commander, Meren of Clan Nel Toth. Then I cast Death Greeter as well. So now whenever another creature is put into the graveyard from play, I gain a life. It's also probably my most forgotten about trigger. On my end step, I get back Steve once again. Secretly, this is not an aristocrat deck, it's just ramp. Scott played a forest into Ghalta and Mavren. That's a big beefy threat that makes other big beefy threats. He passes the turn over to Busterkins, who plays a core Spirit Dancer, hoping to attach some auras to it. He passes the turn over to Kyle, who plays another island. Then attacks me and Scott with his two things that can't be blocked. Before damage, he ninjutsus out Throat Slitter and then Yuriko as well. Yuriko attacking me and Throat Slitter Scott. When the damage is dealt, Throat Slitter says blow up Ghalta and Mavren. That'll trigger my Death Greeter, which I forget about. Yuriko says reveal 2 cards, and then each one of us takes 5 points of life, having a Pongify and Snuff Out revealed, and then they go to his hand, which is great for us. On his end step, he gets another card draw from the Monarch, and also on his end step, I kill my Sakura Tribe Elder once again, getting a forest into play tapped. Onto my turn proper, I play a swamp. I go into combat, swinging against Kyle, who has yet to be dealt with in any real way, so I'm gonna start trying to pressure him there. And I get his Monarch token, I cast Solemn Simulacrum, getting yet another land out onto my battlefield tapped. Then I cast Demon's Disciple. I feel pretty good about playing that one. When that ETBs, everybody has to sack a creature. I choose my Sad Robot, therefore drawing me a card, and also Death Greeters triggering each time one of these creatures is dying. I then cast Haywire Might. Big fan of that little guy. I then use my High Market to sacrifice my not Plaguecrafter. That'll gain me some life and some experience. And what's great is that on my end step, Meren will trigger and I'll get my Demon's Disciple back, therefore sacrificing more stuff. In this case, I choose my Haywire Might, gaining some more life, and Yuriko is dead as well. Once again, gaining some life off of Death Greeter. Then on my end step, I get to draw from the Monarch. On to Scott's turn, he draws and plays a tapped Fortified Village. Nerd. He then recasts his commander, Lathiel, the Bounteous Dawn. He then chooses to copy me by playing his own Haywire Might. And I can't blame him because it is pretty good. He passes the turn to Busterkins, who plays Bright Climb Pathway as his land before casting his commander, Eriette of the Charmed Apple. With that out on the battlefield, he casts Sigarda's Aid, setting up some flashy aura shenanigans. On to Kyle's turn, he plays Siren Storm Tamer once again. He then drops an island while Busterkins tries to distract him. He then transmutes Dimir Infiltrator. He gets to go and find another 2-drop and put it into his hand. After revealing it, it was Tetsuko Umezawa, Fugitive. So now all of his little things can't be blocked. I play a Phyrexian Tower on my turn, and follow that up by casting Birthing Pod. I plan to use that bad boy to find me some creatures that can help me close out the game. I cast Yehedi, Undying Partisan. I love me an instant speed sack outlet. Then I activate Birthing Pod, and I sacrifice my Demon's Disciple, triggering Meren as well as Death Greeter. I'll get to go find a 4-drop creature, and I think Falconroth Noble fits the bill pretty well here. Afterwards, I attack Kyle with Meren, trying to chip away at his significant life total, dropping him to 33. On my end step, I get to bring back my Demon's Disciple, once again, having my opponents sacrifice a creature, as well as one of my own. I'll get a bunch of triggers from this. Death Greeter will gain me some life. Falconroth Noble will have me ping down Kyle's life total and gain some life from that as well. Yehedi gets some +1/+1 counters on it, and I got more experience as well. I drew from the Monarch and passed to Scott, and he plays Knight of Autumn. When that enters the battlefield, he decides to destroy target artifact. In this case, it's my Birthing Pod, and I'm not happy about it. He moves into combat, swinging at Kyle, hitting him for 2, gaining 2, and therefore gaining some +1 counters on his commander as well. Passes the turn to Busterkins. He draws and plays a Swamp as his land for turn before casting Swords to Plowshares on my Meren. I have a small plan up my sleeve, so instead of just having her go back to the command zone and gaining some life, I sacrifice her with High Market, leaving her in my bin. This will trigger Death Greeter as well as Falkenrath Noble, and I ping Busterkins for 1 by doing so. He then casts his commander, Eriette of the Charmed Apple, once again, hoping to get some traction with her and having her stick on the battlefield this time. On Kyle's turn, he just straight up attacks me with Tetsuko Umezawa, of course ninjutsuing out Yuriko after no blocks could be declared. He then reveals a Baleful Strix, so each one of us loses 2. He takes the Monarch from me and draws before passing the turn back over to me. I play a Swamp, and then I cast a Reanimate, and he snap Arcane Denials that, seeing it a mile away, evidently. That makes me very sad, because now Meren is just stuck in my bin unless I could find another effect like that. I move into combat swinging at Kyle, once again taking the Monarch token back, and then on my end step, Scott casts Cosmic Rebirth. He'll bring his Haywire Might back out onto the battlefield and gain some life in the process, therefore gaining more +1/+1 counters on his commander. On his upkeep, Kyle and I both get to draw some cards thanks to his Arcane Denial. Scott's Court of Garenbrig triggers, getting him more +1 counters on his creatures. He then draws for turn. He plays a Forest as his land before swinging at me like a Rudy McBooty. I decide to block his commander with my Death Greeter, but before damage is dealt, I sacrifice it to Yahenni, therefore preventing him from gaining life. This will trigger my Falkenrath Noble. I drain Kyle 1, but Scott still makes away with the Monarch token. On Busterkin's turn, he plays Caves of Koilos as his land before casting Angelic Destiny on his commander. In response, however, Kyle casts Murderous Cut, using Delve in order to reduce the cost of it. So he will kill Eriette, triggering my Yahenni and my Falkenrath Noble, and Angelic Destiny never made it to the battlefield. As a follow-up, Busterkins casts Glory Bearers. That's a card. On Kyle's turn, he casts Temporal Mastery with Miracle because that was the first card that he drew. So he gains an extra turn after this one, yay! He casts Grim Hireling as a follow-up play. Moving into combat at me with Yuriko, he drains each one of us 4 by revealing the One Ring. He also gains 2 treasures because of his Grim Hireling. Then the One Ring goes to his hand. He plays an island as his land. Then he casts Tetsuko Umezawa once again using the treasures. On his next turn, he draws, moves into combat, swinging at each one of us. Thankfully, Scott has Respite in hand, so no creatures deal combat damage this turn, and Scott will gain a little bit of life, gaining more +1 counters as well. Then, as a follow-up, Kyle casts the One Ring, gaining protection from everything, and drawing a card off of it. He casts Moth Dust Changeling beyond that, and then over to my turn. I draw and play Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth as my land for turn, and then I cast Lightning Greaves. I need cards, desperately. I equip Yahenni with my Greaves and move into combat at Scott because I have no other good attacks. He blocks with his Haywire Might, but before damage, he activates it, exiling the One Ring with it. Haywire Might also said gain a little bit of life, so he gains some +1/+1 counters as well. On his upkeep, he gets more counters thanks to his enchantment, and they're doubled because he has the Monarch token. He played a Forest, and then cast Light of Promise on his commander, so he could potentially gain even more +1/+1 counters whenever he gains life. He then moves into combat, swinging at poor Busterkins, taking pity upon him and knocking him out of the game. Scott then gains a bunch of life, going up to 43, and because he gained that much life, he gets that many more +1 counters on his stuff. Kyle casts Pongify in response to Scott's ability, and Scott will finish putting his counters out before casting Swords to Plowshares on his own commander. He's aiming at gaining a bunch of life off of that as opposed to just getting a 3/3. And so he does. His life total becomes a whopping 85. Scott moves to end step and draws, and on Kyle's turn, he goes right into the red zone, swinging primarily at Scott, but a little at me as well. After no blocks are declared, Ninja of the Deep Hours gets Nunjutsu'd out, and there are so many triggers after combat damage is dealt. He gets to draw, he gets 4 whole treasures thanks to Grim Hireling, and then he reveals 4 cards off the top of his library, draining us 5 life. He had a couple of lands in that pile that he was not happy with. Kyle then plays one of those lands, a command tower, before activating Grim Hireling's second ability by sacrificing some treasures, and he shrinks my Falkenrath Noble to death. As a follow-up, he plays Allura, Merry Thief, and then beyond that, he casts that Moth Dust Changeling once again. Kyle had become the Monarch once again and gets to draw on his end step before he passes the turn over to me. And then on my turn, I draw and play a Forest, which I didn't need at all. I move into combat at Kyle just to send him a message at this point. He decides to chump block with Allura. This will have Yahenni get a little bigger. Then over to Scott's turn. On his upkeep, he gets more +1 counters and a Suture Priest. hits the battlefield. So he'll start gaining life and start draining his opponent's life. Kyle casts Rapid Hybridization on Scott's commander when it moved into the red zone. When Lathiel dies, Yahenni will trigger, and Scott will get a 3/3 Frog Lizard. This will trigger Suture Priest, giving him 1 life. On Kyle's turn, he casts Spark Double. That'll have him lose 1 life thanks to Suture Priest. Spark Double, guess what? Became a Yuriko. He then casts Ginger Brute, again losing 1 life thanks to Suture Priest. Got him. Then he drops an Underground River as his land for turn before moving into combat. Scott casts Pledge of Unity before damage is dealt, gaining +1/+1 counters on his creatures and getting a little bit of life as well. That's all. So again, Kyle swung primarily at Scott, but had 2 of his creatures attack me. We resolve the combat damage, then we resolve all of the triggers in the world, and because he has 2 Yurikos now, he gets double the triggers. So he starts revealing cards off the top of his library, ×2. Of note, we see a Nexus of Fate, a Draco, and a Treasure Cruise. This will drain me out of the game and drop Scott to 28. All of those cards go to Kyle's hand. He then casts Nexus of Fate. He will once again get another turn in this game. Nexus of Fate will get shuffled into his library. He'll discard a whole bunch of cards before taking his next turn. He plays a Swamp and then casts Scroll Rack. With that out onto the battlefield, he'll go ahead and activate Scroll Rack. He chooses to swap the top few cards of his library for some of the cards in his hand. Then he moves into combat with all of the unblockable creatures that he has against Scott, dropping him to 24. And again, double Yuriko triggers has him reveal all the cards in the world that he needed to knock Scott out of the game, including that Draco and Treasure Cruise once again. Congratulations, Kyle. Good job, man. As promised, here's Meatball. He's so chunky. And there you have it. That's the game. What did you think of this variety matchup featuring commanders from newer sets as well as older ones? We had a lot of fun playing this game. Please let us know what you thought about it in the comments, and as always, thank you for watching.